Welcome to Antidote Radio. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Gushel.
Today we're going to deviate somewhat from our from some of the topics we normally talk about. Although this topic is definitely extremely fits to a large extent with what we talk about. Although I think it is in some ways a deviation from where we normally go with our conversations. And that topic today is the topic of law enforcement and some of the various issues and some of the various angles surrounding law enforcement here in America. As you're going to see, there's also going to be a very international tie to this conversation, particularly when it comes to the state of Israel. But I think it's important for us to try to have a conversation about this. Is something I've wanted to do for a while now. It's important to have a conversation that I believe is sober and reasoned with analysis, where we just look at as many angles of this as possible, because I think that law enforcement is one area where there's a lot of there's a lot of noise and there's very little actual, I think, real honest assessments of what is and is not going on. And not to say we have all the answers, but I think we can provide an analysis that breaks away from a lot of the bias. You see a lot of the overtly obvious bias in one form or another, where the narrative in this country now, it seems, with the increasing divisiveness, this goes back to the Michael Brown shooting in 2014, and even before that. But that's when the moment, you can pinpoint the moment when the debate and the conversation about law enforcement, the divisiveness over the topic of law enforcement, really, I think, gathered steam once again for the first time in years. It got to the point, it created the environments where the conversation is what it is now, where we can't even really even have conversations about this stuff, because you've either got two sides of the population. One side believes law enforcement is just inherently evil and racist and bigoted, and that's the end of the story. There's another large portion of the population, unfortunately, increasingly represented by outlets such as those who follow Alex Jones's InfoWars, and we're going to get into that a little later on, that largely believe that law enforcement can pretty much do no wrong. And so we've got two extremes here, and I believe that both of these extremes very much play into the hands of those who seek to keep the populace divided and at each other's throats. Whereas I don't think that we're going to have an actual reasoned and rational conversation about the role that law enforcement is clearly being played to usher in an increased authoritarian state here domestically. But also, we can't have a conversation about the actual meaning of this and the significance of it if we just have a portion of the population that is just all out to portray all law enforcement as being inherently evil and bigoted, or when you just have large portions of the population just believe everything law enforcement does is right and just and should never be questioned. So I think that, Jeremy, this is where we can come in and try to provide an analysis on this that people aren't really going to get a lot of other places, that really looks at all sides of this and try to just give a commentary the best we can on where we think things are going, as well as why it's important to see through these preconceived notions that people have as being largely correct, but also incorrect in a lot of ways.
Yes. So this is I think, a really important topic at this time in this context, especially with the ramp up of the type of scenarios that we saw in Charlottesville, and which we discussed last week. And I think you're right to put this in the context of let's figure out how to get outside of the normal boxes that people might look at this topic with, because as with any topic, we should, especially when we're doing maybe what might be seen as a structural analysis of the more violent, destructive, negative aspects of power, and as the way that it plays out in institutional and individual networks, we should always recognize the humanity of individuals. And I think that of course, that kind of principle is a uniting principle for all political people of good faith. And so, yes, what we're going to be talking about has nothing to do with the with the intention of the average on the beat officer in the United States of America. In fact, I would say that the average on the beat officer in America of good faith should really listen to what we're saying, because not only are they being put on the front lines of a synthetically divided and violently destructive, I would say seditious and very likely treasonous operation going on in the United States of America, but they may have an actual deep responsibility to figuring this out and calling it to account and lawfully deconstructing it. And similar to the way that maybe when we would talk about things like the role of the U.S. military around the world, especially in an amped up situation post September 11th, that we are not denigrating the individual soldier in terms of their motivation, especially those with the motivation to defend, to be willing to put their time and their energy and their life to what they see as defend. At the same time, it's really not the case that the way that you respect an individual is just by saying, "Thank you for your service, thank you for your service," especially in relationship to the kind of institutions that we have in the United States of America, where it's not about, when you take an oath to in the United States military, it's not to follow illegal orders. In fact, it's explicit that you're supposed to not follow illegal orders. But the primary thing you take allegiance to is the nature of the principles behind our form of government, which is not to an individual leader or an individual administration. And so in that way, it's outside the realm of what you might see as the military junta example of how a country runs its military. So that's part of this. And so the showing respect to the individual soldier actually has to do with calling them to their higher responsibility as an individual, not to accept either their sort of innocence in relationship to maybe being a tool of the empire, and they're just a tool in some ways, and neither whitewashing the importance of their individual moral responsibility to do what they said they were going to do when they enlisted, not to go adventure and shoot at people, or even to protect their brothers and sisters in uniform, nor even to just protect the idea of national security and the so-called homeland, but to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Why would the domestic piece be in there if it were not a real possibility? Yeah. And as we've seen throughout history, most of the real internal threats to our societies over time have come from very high levels of power, and not from your average person horizontally related to you across the spectrum on the street politically. So that also translates to police officers. They are peace officers. They are supposed to protect and defend. They are not there to enforce political occupations, whether it's a mental occupation or a physical occupation. And so the structural analysis that we're going to be doing has to do with what is what is actually going on in relationship to our police departments, and the larger idea of policing in the United States of America in the 21st century. But also, what is the role of the individual police officer in understanding this and figuring out where this might go?
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. I thank you for giving that summary analysis. That this is not an attack on law enforcement. It's not an attack on police officers. This is much like when you critique the military, when you critique and you speak honestly about various activities that the U.S. military has participated in around the globe, whether or not it's not an indictment of the average serving military officer or the person who's just rank and file wearing a uniform who truly believes that he or she is serving his or her country. It's in the same way, we're not just out to just attack law enforcement or just to criticize the individual law enforcement officer because at a prior job I must have worked with somewhere probably close to at least a dozen different police officers who I got to off-duty police officers who worked security who I got to know at least on somewhat of a level and I know enough about these people to know that just they're human beings just like we are. I mean, they're human beings just like everybody else. They have families that they want to get home to every night that they care for just like everybody else does. And therefore, it's important to take that into context. And this whole idea that law enforcement is evil and inherently bigoted, on one hand, it serves this that's a narrative that is welcomed because on one hand it divides and conquers the population, the people, and also it feeds into this. It covers up what actually appears to be going on with law enforcement when you make it all about, well, they're inherently evil institution, and that way all the focus is on people wanting to talk about how we hate the pigs so much, we hate the cops, just a bunch of evil bigoted pigs, and we hate them, when in reality it's that is taking away from how law enforcement is being used, and it gets people away from what appears to be very real examples of top-down corruption within law enforcement that's being used to serve a specific purpose, and that is the increased militarization via increased methods of brutality that are mainly being learned in places such as Israel. And that gets the heat off of that and off of the very real post 9/11 consequences of what has happened with these law enforcement agencies, and instead get you focused on the individual cop and arguing about whether or not every cop you meet is going to be a racist pig of some type. So this is a vitally important narrative, false narrative, I believe, largely false narrative that is used uh, for propaganda purposes. And I think, unfortunately, it works like a charm. And as we're going to see, the collective labeling of anybody who is outspoken in opposition to various practices of law enforcement agencies is also manipulated and twisted to meet certain agendas. So definitely there is this the whole idea of the bigoted, inherently racist, inherently corrupt an officer, everyday officer, has to be defeated. And on the same hand, the collective characterization of all people who are critical of law enforcement practices as being just, they're just they want to just tear down law and order and civilization and those who are trying to keep us safe and all that. So I mean, clearly on both sides, there's a lot of programming I think that needs to be deconstructed. So I think we're doing a good job with this here.
So it is the case that in terms of this issue of policing in America, there is a longer term, maybe more macro or deep issue around the racial dynamics of it, in how aspects of police institutions in some cases and police culture in other cases have emerged historically in relationship to the slave history of the United States of America, and in some ways the white supremacist history of the United States of America. At the same time, the United States has made very real and very certain progress in relationship to some of those issues as you move into the present. At the same time, I think it could be credibly said that there has also been a retrenchment or a backwards moving in terms of the larger structural dynamics of racism and supremacism in the United States that have a lot to do with some of these more covert forces, whether it's the so-called drug war and the pretty obvious moving of direct moving of destructive drugs through communities in the United States of America, most obviously and most intensely circling around communities of color and black communities in the urban cores of the United States of America. And not that this has stopped or let go, but has also been increasingly amped up in the wake of September 11th. Maybe the shift has been from the cocaine and the crack epidemics that was tied in through the CIA's networks and channeling it into the black urban cores in the United States during the Cold War and the Iran-Contra situation and the funding of death squads through drug money. But drug money has always been a key component of black operations, off the books operations throughout the sort of highest levels of covert intelligence operations around the world, whether it's all the way back to the British imperial overlay of the drug trade and the opium wars, and now again in the 21st century, we of course see the amping up of the opiate scourge, and mainly in relationship to Afghanistan. And you can go look at the chart and see the 1 year when the Taliban was in charge, and opium poppy production went almost all the way down. And then September 11th and the re-amplification of that. And so that is still in play here. But what's interesting about maybe the opioid and heroin crisis in the United States is it seems to be much more racially, in a way, hitting white communities in a more amplified fashion than it, in terms of the crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s hit black communities. So as we'll see later on, we are now all black folks in some ways, but more intensely, we are all Palestinians. And what we've seen most intensely in the wake of September 11th is the big wedding. That was the code word for September 11th, the big wedding. Did Al-Qaeda come up with that? And what is Al-Qaeda? Of course, we've seen some of the reports of potential Mossad officers running ISIS cells out of Lebanon. Those are some recent reports. So what is Al-Qaeda, of course, but more directly, what is the big wedding? What is the big wedding? What we've seen in a de facto fashion post-September 11th in the United States of America is a merging, a wedding of the United States and Israel in terms of our mentalities. This is, of course, also on the record in terms of Netanyahu's response to September 11th. It's immediately good, he said. Well, it's not good, but it'll mean that it will be closer with the United States. And
in other words, it was good, but you just had to watch what he said publicly.
Of course, and it also had to do with the Americans now will understand what it's like to be Israeli and face these violent Arab Muslims who are just can't be reasoned with, and they're just trying to destroy our way of life. So now you know what it's like to be an Israeli. So this big wedding concept, I think, is key to the post 9/11 era. And I'm sure some people will be like, oh, there they go again. It's all about Israel. Blame Israel for everything, And thinking through this as a Jewish American and as someone with the Jewish background, some religious. Much cultural and then some ethnic, if it can be seen in that way, and it's definitely interpreted ethnically in relationship to holding land in Israel, or it's so there's a larger, deeper question about the nature of Jewishness. But putting that aside for now, and maybe in a future show we can talk about that. I just want to talk about the perspective of a Jewish American coming to terms with the evidence around September 11th. And first of all, as an American, to begin to process information that something like the most massive murderous attack on in the modern American world has the elements of being signed off on, or at some level by high elements in one's own society and government, is a pretty difficult emotionally and psychologically thing to contend with. And then when you add to that, if you continue to follow facts where they lead, and you work on being honest in both an internal, in terms of your own mind and own heart, but also externally in speaking with your fellow humans, then you begin to also, as a Jewish American, have to deal with that. It's not just the U.S. It's not internal only, and that you begin to follow facts, and the facts point to that if there were a single foreign entity that has the most of any in terms of means, motive, and opportunity, in terms of solving a crime, then it goes directly to the heart of the Jewish state. So in terms of not only being an American, but being a Jew and a Jewish American, there's then a double intensity of pressure and psychological blockages and emotional baggage that comes along with dealing with these types of things. So I bring that up just to say, look, I'm not interested in trying to overblame a certain group of people or a certain country or certain networks. I am interested, both as an American and as a Jew, in an ethical form of society, an ethical form of government. And so I follow the facts where they lead. And so in researching what the heck is going on in post 9/11 America, in terms of the shootings of people by police, you go and you look. Is this actually a ramp up of? Is this an escalation of violent force being used by elements of police against citizens, or is this just a result of the ascent of technology in people's hands and having cameras and iPhones and social media to be able to spread this information around? And when you dig into the statistics, it looks like, no, this is a real phenomenon. There is an uptick in the use of violence against citizens by elements of the police. So then the question is, what's going on? Is this mainly a racial? Is this a sort of escalation of a sort of a racist phenomena against maybe primarily against black folk, as it's sort of being seen in relationship to all the black men who are being shot? Okay. And then when you look at that, it looks like that maybe that's not really the explanation here. And that, yes, because of this historical dynamic that I pointed to before, in terms of some policing coming out of a slave society, specifically around runaway slaves or that type of thing, that there is this... and plus what I mentioned about the drug war and the structural dynamics of the covert destabilization and war against our own society here at home by high level intelligence elements, that there is the case that black folks continue to be, I mean, unless people want to put forth the sort of the biological explanation of criminality that we talked about last week, as
or that combined with the idea that the only time cops ever shoot is when they've got to deal with a thug who's just breaking the law and is a threat to the officer's life, which I think is probably, that's probably not entirely true sometimes, but that's what's used in many cases, especially by right wingers, to just whitewash any type of serious questions about police conduct. So you've got that as well. And sometimes the two of those coincide with each other.
Yes,
so.
And so looking back at this idea that there is a structural component to why black folks in America have high levels of contact with the police. And that's a fairly complex situation. And I would say that because of that higher level of contact, the black community has dealt with this level, the violence against individuals, whether, no matter what the individual situations are in terms of what you're saying with. So, but the black community knows this more intensely than other communities. At the same time, it looks like that the racial dynamics of this are not explicit in terms of the post September 11th ramp up escalation of some of this violence. So not to throw that out completely, but it looks like this is a more generalized thing going on here. And so what you see is, in the wake of September 11th, you see the beginning of a very strong relationship of police, a very specific individuals in police departments around the country, especially those in certain leadership positions or those in positions where in the post Homeland Security fusion center apparatus type of scenario, those that are in positions of potential counterterrorism or who are organizers of training, those are the people that are being most intensely sought and then put into training situations in Israel not with the domestic, as it might be seen, the domestic police force in Israel, about how do Israeli police treat other Israelis, but how does the Israeli military intelligence apparatus run a security state against basically a permanently occupied people like the Palestinians in the West Bank or in Gaza to a large extent. So that's what's actually going on here. And hearkening back to last week's conversation, a key player in all of this is the so-called Anti-Defamation League.
The left-wing ADL, the radical left-wing ADL, is all the right-wing commentators want to make us think.
A good point. And so there's two other organizations that I believe are key to this, and one is JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security, something I forget. And anyone who's people should go look at some of the reporting that people at Veterans Today have done around September 11th and JINSA's potential role in that, to see what JINSA might be. And then the American Jewish Congress, is it, or American?
There are two organizations that have similar names: American Jewish Congress, and I believe there's an American Jewish Committee as well.
Yes, I think it's the American Jewish Committee. And okay. I just went to try to look it up on a story and some
might be the one behind Commentary Magazine. I'm not sure.
So what you see is that there has been this big wedding going on here, and this plays out in a lot of ways. This not only plays out in terms of very specific training about thinking about counterterrorism as a concept in the post-September 11th world, and as we've seen, this alleged war on terror, in terms of this is some type of mass movement globally, and there's an Al-Qaeda jihadi cell in every suburban neighborhood, and they're trying to recruit your teenage son for Insight magazine or something like that, has proven to be being largely manufactured, if not completely manufactured, by aspects of FBI, Joint Terrorism Task Force aspects, where if there were a real war on terror, they wouldn't have to manufacture and provoke a lot of these operations that many times they shut down. But I would point out that we have had instances where they have not been shut down, right? And so there are instances of terrorism that happened, whether it's San Bernardino, whatever happened there. There definitely was an aspect of a patsy or an assets who who had eyes on them, who were then blamed for some type of operation that went forward. So this is the case that this is there's a lot of motivation behind this, because you can see there's definitely reports where you understand that part of this just has to do with money and funding and institutional predominance, and that local terrorism task forces or aspects of the FBI know that their funding is highly dependent on whether they can produce big takedowns. So if that's the case, everybody wants some money. So the motivation is to, if there's not terrorism going on in organically in one's community, then the motivation is to manufacture it, and we would hope to then shut it down before it happens. But entrapment is a deep part of this. So that's one aspect of this. And of course, we saw in the wake of September 11th things like Mossad-run Al-Qaeda being caught in the Palestinian administered territories after Ariel Sharon had said there's Al-Qaeda is in Palestine and working with the Palestinians, even though it didn't really make any sense. It made about as much sense as Robert Baer's accusations that Iran was had a role in September 11th. But this is what's going on there. And so not only is there this training that goes about sort of counterterrorism and the idea of what it means in relationship to the population that you are supposedly protecting and serving in terms of the United States of America and what our police are supposed to be doing, it turns that relationship into something like an occupying force. You know, the relationship, the long-term, intergenerational, multi-generational aspect of the entirety of the Israeli security services, but also the vast majority of the Israeli civilian population, many of them required to serve on the front lines of the occupation, in terms of how you view the people that you are allegedly protecting and serving. You begin to see it not as a protecting and serving situation, but a population to figure out how to occupy. And that also is implied in that is that there's always the threat of an insurgency. And you can see this. This is the attitude. This is the growing attitude that's been fostered within the United States of America. Whether it's looking back at things like you can go back and look at certain shootings and very specifically trace them to being directly after certain police elements were being trained in Israel. And whether that was the predominant reason for those types of shootings is not clear, but there is a lot of that type. There is a lot of that type of data that people should take a look at. For example, things like the Oakland police force. Very soon after the elements were sent to Israel for training, along with I think with and Bahrain. It was a Israeli Bahraini joint training situation.
Yeah. Well, with regards to real quick, with regards to Bahrain, real quick, it's worth noting and pointing out that Bahrain is seen as an important base with as far as Iran is concerned for the U.S. military, and that Bahrain was one of the countries where there was a major crackdown on protesters and dissidents during the Arab Spring, and that this was actually suppressed in the American media, as Amber Lyon, who was a former CNN reporter, documented. So it's interesting that in addition to Israel, that these law enforcement here in the U.S. are going to Bahrain to learn tactics, when Bahrain was actually its suppression of dissidents was covered up during the whitewashed, largely covered up by the Western media during the Arab Spring. So just wanted to bring that up.
Another thing in terms of Bahrain is if Gwyneth Todd, the National Security Council whistleblowers, allegations are true, then Bahrain was a key player. The Bahraini security services were a key player in what aspects of the Bush administration and the neoconservatives were trying to do in relationship to a false flag potentially directed at a U.S. naval ship, potentially in the Persian Gulf, in relationship to inflaming an aggressive warfare situation with Iran. So they're a player there, and so this Oakland Police Department that had just gone to this joint training with Israel and Bahrain, they then were the most sort of clearly, intensely violent police force in relationship to the local Occupy movement, Occupy Oakland, and they utilized a large amount of force against Occupy Oakland. So whether that was related to that is not it's not exactly for sure, but I think it's pretty indicative of what the heck is going on here. And this has been going on pretty much very soon thereafter. You sort of see the rise of Homeland Security, the Department of Homeland Security, and the rise of these fusion centers in a concomitant fashion with the rise of this relationship of putting the sort of elite police personnel into Israel on the ground in the Israeli occupation. And I think it goes beyond this. And there's some interesting articles that people should take a look at. There's an article, a more recent article by Phil Giraldi, who talks about America's militarized police, made in Israel, question mark, and discusses a lot of these types of issues. There's also a very interesting article out of Consortium News talking very specifically about the Chicago police. Chicago police adopt Israeli tactics, that points out things like this. There was a big uproar about this black site that was discovered to exist in Chicago. Sounds like black sites run by the CIA post September 11th in many ways. And it is the case that though it hasn't been talked about much, a lot of this kind of approach to so-called counterterrorism or counter crime fighting in the United States of America is Israeli-based. Whether it's the Abu Ghraib and the idea that a lot of that comes from this idea of the torture chambers in the Israeli prisons, where humiliation is a key part of it, and there's some type of designation that the Arab mind only understands either force or ridicule in some way. And we saw even people like Dennis Ross in the midst of the 2016 election campaign and the end of the Obama administration, basically criticizing the Obama administration that he had been a part of by saying, well, Obama's too soft. That's why the Arabs and the Russians don't respect him. He doesn't use enough violence.
Yeah, that mindset's very indicative. I think a lot of people look at American blacks and other non-white groups as being necessary. They only understand force, and therefore they need to have force used against them when necessary. So very much a parallel between Israeli thinking about Palestinians and the way a lot of Americans think about certain non-white groups as far as how law enforcement needs to treat them. They only understand force, things of that nature.
Yes, and that's interesting that you bring up this sort of perception of the black community, and I think that also plays into these issues of the sort of the attempt to call or designate Black Lives Matter as a terrorist organization by certain controlled elements of the right, most obviously InfoWars, who instead of holding the ground in Ferguson to be a peaceful moderator, to understand that there was a very real that black folks in America were holding a certain leading line in terms of dealing with the escalation of the police state that they were encountering, that transcended the questions of the individual shooting, but also included that. And instead, they were there just basically saying, well, Black Lives Matter is a George Soros-run organization, and they're only here to inflame the matter. And I don't think it's as simple as that. Yes, George Soros came in after the fact and began to promote and fund certain aspects, but there's something going on here that's much deeper than some type of controlled opposition. And I would point out that out of Black Lives Matter has come certain manifestos and statements that includes a very strong solidarity in terms of what they see as anti-racist organizing with the Palestinian people. And I would just point out that in my own encounter, when you and I were at the Kansas City Public Library, and I was at a microphone in a critical dialogue or questioning of Dennis Ross, the former U.S. ambassador to Israel, who had just completed a highly propagandized lecture co-sponsored by a group that helps fund aspects of Israel in the wake of their war making, that when we had been forced ejected in what I would say is an unlawful fashion from what was clearly what's known as a designated public forum, the most protected form of speech in the United States is not, talking about cultural things on the internet or talking about these types of things, but it's core political speech at a microphone in a public assembly. That's key. And in the midst of that, we were ejected by two main individuals, both of them coincidentally, supposedly, who had both been trained in Israel. And one of them, the arresting officer, had worked in the local fusion center, and he had a long-standing relationship with the aspects of the local Jewish community that were part of this Midwestern collaboration very soon after September 11th, one of the earliest cities that created this relationship with Israel were some of the Midwestern cities, including Kansas City. But when I was in the lobby, having been handcuffed without my arrest ever being announced, I was sat down on the floor, and three sort of street level on the beat officers came in, and they were standing above me, and I started talking to them. I was telling them what had just happened, and I said, "This looks like the Palestinification of the United States of America." And what I saw was the black police officer. He nodded perceptibly to me. I saw that. And the other officers were not black, and they didn't negatively react, but they didn't react in that kind of understanding fashion. So I would just point out that there is an aspect of this that I'm very suspicious of those who would want to call Black Lives Matter a terrorist organization or say that they're just completely run by George Soros, as an organization like that confronts some of the most destructive aspects of the occupying force mentality that's been escalated and trained and seduced and monetized into the structural mind of the American police forces, as somehow they just need to be labeled by Homeland Security as a terrorist organization. That is a major issue. You also see that elements of the so-called progressive Jewish left who have tried to talk them down from their solidarity with the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. And I would point out that I'd say there's some key possibilities here that I believe are trying to be messed with. And that would include something like the Dallas shootings, right? Where that's straight out of American Gladio. Dallas, snipers in buildings in Dallas, snipers from high level in Dallas.
Unheard of.
And of course, the police chief in Dallas also had a strong Israel connection, had been to Israel.
And there was a very, very strong effort to pin that on Black Lives Matter and even on elements of the old Black Panthers and the new Black Panthers, which are supposed to remind people of the old Black Panthers, the old, the radical groups who just want to kill pigs and tear down society. So there's a very orchestrated effort to pin that Dallas sniping on those groups.
Yeah, so there, as we talked about in terms of Charlottesville, there's the whether it's the COINTELPRO or other type of national security intelligence operatives, or more private intelligence operatives, or foreign intelligence operatives who are attempting to escalate this situation. I would have people, in terms of evidence, go look at this black Mercedes that put a black duffel bag in the trunk and sped off from the scene in Dallas. There was never any follow up, as far as I could see, in terms of that. But besides that, what we're seeing is the attempt to provoke and legitimize at the very same time political violence, rather than core political speech, core political press. Let me remind people, press, as found by the Supreme Court, is a, quote, fundamental personal freedom. It's not about your Twitter account. It's not about your lanyard around your neck from whatever corporate outlet. No, this is a natural right. I would point out that policing is not a profession that's described in the Constitution. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have a role, or an important role, in terms of if they were to reform themselves and actually be peace officers. But I would point out that its press is the only profession that's mentioned in the Constitution. So that's key to all of this. So those are our powers that are attempted to being undermined in the midst of this. And so to me, it looks like that certain angles of political action are really possible here, and are attempted to be obscured and disrupted and red herringed away. And those have to do with linking the boycott, divestment, sanction movement to this problem of not only Talpiot, high technology, the back doors that have been engineered into our technology, not only by the NSA, but reminder, the Israelis are getting raw feeds from the NSA. A lot of the actual switching and networking technology that's used by the NSA in some of these backdoor rooms, such as what was exposed by the AT&T whistleblower in terms of San Francisco, a lot of that technology is Israeli created. So you combine that with the Talpiot program and the Unit 8200 in terms of the Israeli NSA, and how close they are to the owners and directors of American intelligence. I mean, American technology companies, such as Google, such as Facebook. Everyone can go and see the relationships of Google and Facebook back to Israel directly, including actual buildings, big buildings that are being built where there's commanding posts. But not only that aspect, but also this police, the training aspect, the managing of the American mind aspect. And I forgot to mention earlier that part of this relationship that was set up, especially by groups maybe like the so-called Anti-Defamation League, that part of this idea of setting up the American police with the Israelis is a propaganda coup. It's a way of being like, oh, we have the the brave and the proud police officers on our side, understanding that the Israeli are a beleaguered people by these.
It's a powerful propaganda move to get the right wing that traditionally believes in a more conservative culture as far as law and order on. It's a powerful propaganda tool for that purpose.
So boycott, divestment, sanctions should not only focus on high tech and Talpiot programs, which they definitely should, but they should also focus. They should link up with Black Lives Matter in a very specific way about these training programs back into Israel, which are. There's a lot of evidence pointing to that they have created an escalation of an occupying mentality that has materially and very violently and negatively affected the lives of hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of American people. And I would point out to the police officers of good faith, and I would just point from my own experience. There's nothing like, in a way, meeting a police officer who is of good faith and treats you respectfully and is open to an honest conversation and protects your First Amendment rights. That's a very deep and beautiful thing. and I want to see more and more of that. There's also a few things worse than a shady police officer or a tyrannical police officer who sees in every citizen just someone to either figure out how to write a ticket and get some money from and meet a quota, or even worse, to dominate in a psychological fashion.
This would be exemplified by that sheriff who Trump offered to help ruin the life of the local politician in Texas who was opposing forced asset forfeiture without warrants.
Yes.
So it would be exemplified in that kind of mind.
Or I would say, I would assert, or even a patriot like Joe Arpaio, who used.
Or David Clark, who also trained in Israel.
I would just like to remind people, I don't know what the deal is in terms of Arpaio's relationship with Israel. I don't know if it's existent. I do know he did have a relationship with certain shady characters like Orly Taitz, the Israeli-connected dentist, I think, who was part and parcel of the controlled opposition part of the Obama birth certificate, of which there are actual much more real questions that I believe actually come home to Kansas to roost. But putting that aside, Arpaio's big claim to fame, I remember when there were people in We Are Change LA who were being like, we need to stop all this 9/11 truth stuff, or at least we need to add on a coalition with Joe Arpaio. And what he was known for back then was not the racial profiling aspect that came after the rise of the immigration, anti-immigration, illegal immigration movement, but that he was willing to put his prisoners in make them wear pink panties. That does seem reminiscent to me of things like Abu Ghraib and some of these Israeli prison tactics. By the way, one of the most important recognized journalistic voices of the Obama era was the Atlantic editor Jeffrey Goldberg, I think his name is, right? He got a good training in Israeli prisons too. Okay, so this is a very diffuse mentality amongst obviously important journalists, key sheriffs, people that are being typified as some type of patriots, whether Sheriff Clark, who wears his Israeli pin, or who's praised the wall. It's even the case that people like the arresting officer in my case had been to Israel to go observe the wall and to learn from the wall. Okay, and we pointed this out before. The wall, there was a key image in Trump's campaign, and what does it materially mean? It means a Lockheed Martin Israeli contractor wall that is probably pointed both directions, if we were to think about it.
Funded in large part by Home Depot and the Trump backing co-founder of Home Depot, Bernard Marcus.
So that's the left. That's what I'm proposing for what might be seen as the left. A partnership between the best elements of Black Lives Matter and Boycott, Divestment, Sanction to call out organizations like the Anti-Defamation League in relationship specifically to the training of American police in occupied Palestine. Okay, that's one thing. The other side of this is the right, and this is not necessarily completely of the right, but if you go look at a lot of the First Amendment auditors on the internet, on YouTube, I believe that it looks like a lot of them are probably sort of have right-wing sentiments. They understand the idea of the Constitution in maybe a more conservative way. And they are out there making contact with police every single day. And they're doing a very important function because what they're doing is they're reinforcing that we, the American people, have inherent God-given rights that include the right, the press functions to be able to film in public, from public, of anything that you can see, including public officials in their public duties in buildings. Okay, this, of course, was attempted there in the sort of counter so-called terrorism mind state. There was this idea of the every American with a camera, every patriotic journalist, independent journalist, is somehow just doing surveillance for a some type of coming terrorist attack. That, I believe, is mind control. Of course, should make contact with people. So what I'm proposing for this group of people, the First Amendment auditors, who come more from I believe, from maybe a conservative understanding of the Constitution, is to educate themselves, to go listen to Brendan O'Connell, go listen to some of his conversations with Nick Spiro in relationship to the Talpiot program in terms of this backdoor technology, high technology, that also should look into September 11th, read Christopher Bolin, very specifically understand what September 11th was, what the so-called war on terror is, what Homeland Security actually represents beyond the sort of domestification of the Phoenix program, as we pointed out from people like Douglas Valentine before. But also look into this training aspect. So when you actually make contact, when First Amendment auditors make contact with police and other officials, they can create a conversation that's not only about the First Amendment and speech and press in a sort of hypothetical situation, but utilize that opportunity to educate in a very deep fashion, in a very patriotic fashion. Because really, when you see the combination here, the combination of the most treasonous singular act in the history of the United States of America, September 11th, tied into the highest levels of the U.S. security apparatus, tied directly back to the highest levels of the Israeli security apparatus, come then to see the wake of it. It's a seditious wake. It's about I forgot to mention that some of these training programs in Israel also are focused around protesters, how to basically go against dissidents, how to enlist the public in the war on terror. And that's what we saw. That's what we saw in this auditorium, Truman Auditorium at the Kansas City Public Library last year. Were people with a mentality of that some type of speech is dangerous, that a dialogue is dangerous, and then material violence happened because of that. So that's my second part of that, is to tell the right to look into this. Again, a focus would be somewhere like the Anti-Defamation League, but also potentially JINSA, and read some of the Veterans Today articles about what was actually happening with the Israeli intelligence network surrounding Manhattan on September 11th, and educate the next police officer that you encounter not only about your First Amendment rights, but use your First Amendment rights to talk about what's actually going on here in relationship to a foreign military intelligence power. So we have a couple minutes left here. You can just take it away and wrap it up if you want.
Yeah, thanks for breaking all that down. And what we're seeing here, and this should go without saying, but we're not trying to just whitewash or praise these various movements. Like, I'm wary and skeptical of anybody who's like, well, don't criticize, because I saw some tweets from, don't criticize Antifa or else, you're aiding with the fascists, or don't criticize BLM, because there are elements that need to be criticized within these groups, because very clearly they're being used at some level as obvious controlled opposition agents of chaos and destabilization themselves. So obviously it should be, I would never tell anybody not to criticize these organizations in some aspects, but also what this does, all this information we're presenting here raises the question: who are the outlets that are the most critical of BLM, most critical of Antifa? It's these right-wing outlets that we've identified as being behind the rise of Donald Trump and the propaganda promoting Donald Trump as a great American patriot, that have these links within the far right in Israel and hard right Zionist circles. They're the ones who have the most vested interest in portraying these organizations as being enemies of humanity, as enemies of the truth. And so anytime you see these reports, keep a skeptical eye. Be honest about, like, say, infiltration and funding and nefarious sources being behind these groups to an extent, but also know that the information you're getting about these organizations is coming from outlets that have a vested agenda in defaming them any way possible.
Yes. So let's keep up the criticism. Groups like Black Lives Matter should begin to have this conversation. Root out those who are attempting to disrupt, escalate into violence, or to create a left-right disjunction. So there's no conversation. The conversation must be escalated. Escalate the conversation to a highly factual and moral manner. So until next week, thank you so much for this conversation, Greg, and I'll see you
Yeah.
later.
All right. Talk.
Bye.
Bye.